Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. So finally back with the usual setup. Hopefully the audio issues are all fine. I hope you guys have had a wonderful week yourselves in terms of FPL. I myself am still waiting very much for this week to culminate because I've got 10 players left effectively and would hopefully like to see the arrow be green on a week where I'm using a chip. Having said, a lot of people are using chips as well. People are bench boosting. People are also free hitting, probably with a better free hit in terms of how things have gone so far. The Crystal Palace result, I think, was the toughest one to take just in terms of that general outcome happening, especially with Bournemouth being up a man effectively for most of the game, right? That was the first half kind of red card from Chris Richards. So a little bit shocking, but I think the big positive that I got from that game was actually Kluivert coming back, starting, playing 90 minutes, which is a huge positive for my Gameweek 34 team. A huge negative, however, was that João Pedro red card. I suppose that was, a while in the making because we've seen many interactions of João Pedro being quite silly over the season. Cunha's actually been the one who's been suspended more often, but João Pedro sort of with his own action this season, getting a red card, and that's going to have a huge impact for me this week, and probably means that I'll play 10 men or with a hit this week effectively. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit later in terms of my transfer plans, but in terms of the free hit, how things are going, just to quickly recap off of that, De Bruyne did play the minutes we wanted. Outcome so far, not so great. Did Man City have a lot of chances? I wouldn't say so necessarily. When it comes to Saka and Salah, they had plenty of chances though themselves. Not that it really meant much because Salah and Saka's effective ownership were, I think, close to above 100. Definitely around my ranked tier. It was slightly below 100 for Saka, and I think Salah was still above 100. But then, ultimately 5-6% one direction or the other doesn't really mean much. Saka had plenty of chances, so I felt like the logic of bringing Saka into the draft made a lot of sense. He was, unfortunately, of course, fouled quite heavily by Leif Davis, who also got a red resulting from that action. But I think Saka, with the chances he had, you have to say that was probably a good pick in terms of decision making on the free hit. Would it have been better, of course, to have, let's say, someone like Trossard, who I absolutely detest, by the way. 3 away goals now in the last 2 games that he's played away. And when I owned him, it was just 1 assist versus West Ham, a huge or not West Ham, sorry, but I think it was Leicester, and then actually a huge captaincy blank versus West Ham at home, and just so much of nothingness. And he's just suddenly back and firing. So good for Trossard, and not so good for my enjoyment of the thought of owning Trossard over what was a huge sort of selection of game weeks where Bruno himself was doing insanely well. Saliba Kira working out well. In terms of the free hit, I think, yes, I was definitely considering some sort of, maybe not having Rashford in the draft, but I was actually concerned about Marino minutes. I was also concerned about Trossard's minutes for the second game. But, as it turns out, sometimes game to game, you can't really quite call it. But yeah, Ipswich was the beautiful game for all the Arsenal attacking assets. Nice to get 2 clean sheets to kind of hedge against the field. A lot of people do own Saliba Raya, so I don't feel too positive about that. Whereas with City, of course, going De Bruyne over someone like Ruben Diaz, unfortunately, just means that I'm now down on points in that situation. And of course, Munoz is on the bench, whilst I went for Martinez just because he had slightly higher clean sheet odds compared to Crystal Palace. Now, of course, it just looks incredibly stupid because I'm 7 points down Henderson, and I had Henderson in my previous team anyways. But we'll have to see with Man City. It's almost like I'm pitting 2 of my players against Martinez. So clearly, I don't really care about the Martinez clean sheet now. I'd rather more points from Marmoush, more points from De Bruyne. With Guardiola, probably, hopefully, another clean if he can get that. But conversely, I also have 2 Aston Villa attackers. And Watkins actually played really well. He did start versus Newcastle. I did think it was very likely that Watkins was going to start one of the games, and he does have a good historical record versus Newcastle. Plus, of course, Rashford had played 3 starts in a row. I still looked at the market odds for Rashford and actually was deciding on Rashford over Bowen on the last minute. I don't know if anyone saw my Twitter, but yeah, I was definitely considering that because I did think that Bowen would have the minutes in one singular fixture that was amazing, which was Southampton at home, versus, let's say, someone like Rashford in his circumstance where he actually has a lot of upside now because he's got absolutely guaranteed penalties. The kind of goals and assists expected numbers are really, really good. He had chances as well within 10 minutes versus Newcastle. Hopefully he starts versus Man City, and then who knows about the FA Cup. I don't really care at this point because I don't own too many Villa players, so can't say I am hoping too much for Villa to perform within the FA Cup. I also misspoke in the previous video where I did say that Crystal Palace were going to play them at Sellers Park. That's wrong. Obviously, they're playing at Wembley. Wasn't thinking about that, unfortunately. At the time, probably wasn't so dialed in. But interestingly, of course, the Aston Villa odds have moved a little bit stronger to them qualifying for the FA Cup final. So it seems like the markets are very much firmly on Aston Villa winning that tie versus Crystal Palace, and I'm with my 0 Aston Villa players probably in a slightly worse position compared to some of the rest of the field who have Rodgers, for example, in their rolling teams. When it comes to the rest of the draft, I did go for Mateta in the end, just because I didn't think, I just thought that Mateta was actually very likely to start 2 games in a row versus Watkins, who seemingly was probably going to play 1 game and come off the bench for the other, but have very limited minutes if he was to come off the bench. And I still think that that's likely going to happen, but as it turns out, Watkins is already 1 goal, 1 assist up. And yeah, the goalkeeper situation isn't great, whereas almost every other player and team have gotten clean sheets as well. And I can see the bench being a bit painful there. So that's it for this type of game week. What can you do? Part of the reason why I wanted to go for Martinez was to kind of back against, let's say, what people were bench boosting in terms of the likes of Isak, the likes of other Newcastle players, of course. So I was kind of hoping for an all-out Aston Villa result there. As it turns out, didn't happen. But that's it for this game week. We then move on to a situation where I have João Pedro, I need to manage that, and then I have 2 free transfers as well to get myself first of all to 10 men, and then I can consider the moves going forwards. And in terms of sort of wider strategy, we will still not really be able to kind of have a good idea of what transfers to make on 34 with having the information needed for the FA Cup finals, right? And that means we won't know exactly what the doubles will be on 36 if we have any. We also don't know if it makes sense to move into certain players, right? So the issue, I suppose, with my strategy, but I think everyone is in a similar camp, is that in my position, I will have, let's say, the 1 free transfer coming out of Game Week 34, and then I at Game Week 35 don't really have to make any moves. And when it comes to Game Week 36, I probably have 2 free transfers, whereas everyone else is on free at 34. They therefore don't get to roll a transfer. They probably used all their transfers this week, and their situation is most likely going to be, once again, on Game Week 35. They also roll and they reach Game Week 36 with 2 free transfers. So I think from a strategy and kind of transfer perspective, I'm not necessarily more ahead or more behind the rest of the field when it comes to setting up for double Game Week 36 if it is to happen. What I do unfortunately have to do, very much like people who made transfers this week, is I kind of have to commit to transfers that have a more medium to long-term value. So whilst people were moving into doublers this week potentially, or if they were extremely savvy, somehow moved into Mbumo and the likes of Wisa for a huge, gigantic haul and works out really well, for example, for future gaming, I will have to make moves without knowing the FA Cup semi-final impacts. And then I can actually probably start to bet on certain forwards, certain midfielders that I want to move into, and potentially someone that's worth a hit on Game Week 34, just on the isolation game week here. So that's what I'll probably say is the most critical thing from my strategy that I have to get right. I have to make sure that I pick medium to long-term picks that are flexible depending on whatever the landscape is, regardless of the FA Cup outcomes. And I'll talk about that right now, to be honest, because I think when I look at the transfers, I believe I have to sell João Pedro and I have to sell probably one of Eze or Sar. I think with my money in the bank, it's unlikely that I really need to care about selling Eze or Sar. I might just want to keep Eze because he's actually lower owned and Sar is actually very highly owned in the field. And then Saliba is probably going to be my sell. The reason why I'm tempted to sell Saliba is someone who, when we look at fixtures, isn't actually someone who I care so much about. Bournemouth at home is probably one of their nicer games to close out the season. And then the next good game, I would say, is Southampton away. So, is there going to be a huge sort of monumental loss for selling Saliba now? I don't think so, personally. I think I'm happy to sell Saliba. It will be Game Week 38 where that probably bites me the most. But I like the idea of someone like a Ryan Sessegnon this week as a hit-worthy transfer. But the core transfers that I have to make this week would be Mbumo, in my opinion, who I feel like is incomparable in the midfield position. I've mentioned this many times within my cheat sheet in terms of, how I see Mbumo, Wisa, or not Wisa, sorry, but Bowen, Bruno, these types of players. And simply, whilst Brentford theoretically don't have too much to play for in the league because they're kind of in a weird spot where they're still pretty far away from some European spots, but they are still playing players like Mbumo and Wisa 90 minutes a game. And they're still trying, which is important. And the likes of Bowen, for example, you can just see, I think, just generally worse in terms of XGI, in terms of penalties, in terms of how West Ham's performing as an overall team, right, as we close out the season. When I look across to, let's say, someone like Bruno, he's starting to get rotated and rested for the Europa League games. And that's a huge impact on actually looking at targeting teams in the future and seeing, for example, a team like Arsenal who can rotate in the future. Chelsea, for example, with Palmer, I mean, he's absolutely been horrific, but compared to Saka, I suppose there's the benefit is that he's probably going to be rotated much less than Saka, which is nice, even though they're also battling for the European Conference League kind of winning position. But when it comes to, let's say, João Pedro, he just has to be a sell because of the red card. So interesting. I think Mbeumo is an absolute lock. But this question about the forward is actually quite interesting because there's many situations within the FA Cup semifinals that can create, I think, different optimalities for different strikers. When I think about someone who's impervious to all outcomes, I think Wisa is one of them because we mentioned, yes, of course, Nottingham Forest away looks like a really bad fixture to bring Wisa in, and same with Mbeumo. But this is still Nottingham Forest coming off of hopefully an FA Cup game where they would have put in a very, very tough shift. And then you actually get a fully rested Brentford team that probably would have been resting for around, 8, 9, 10 days. Maybe that's too much, but they'd be fully rested versus a Nottingham Forest team that would have probably gone all out in the FA Cup semifinals. And then you, of course, embark on a great run of games anyways for Wisa and Mbeumo headed up until the end of the season. So I think Wisa is a very no-nonsense type pick who makes a lot of sense. The pick that I think has the highest amount of upside right now based on FA Cup semifinal chances and the kind of implications of future double game weeks is Evan Nilsson, right? Evan Nilsson is someone who has the highest chance of having a double game week in game week 36. The reason why I say this is because Man City versus Bournemouth would be one of the double game week 36 games if that moves to 36. And of course, that is sort of backing Man City as a finals contender. As things stand, Man City have the highest chance of getting towards the finals, then Aston Villa, then Crystal Palace, then Nottingham Forest. So in terms of order of sequences, the doubles are very much backed by those teams. Crystal Palace face versus Wolves, which is why Cunha comes into the picture. As far as Aston Villa versus Tottenham, not so interested in any of those players, so can't say I really care about them. Wood is also a potential doubler, but he's almost the flip side of the coin of Evan Nilsson, where he's got probably slightly better fixtures than someone like Evan Nilsson. If I look at Wood's fixtures, they're actually really, really good. Still got a Leicester at home game here, regardless of whether he doubles or not. The 37 game is really good, which means that the double would be absolutely elite for Wood. And then a lot of home games as well, just in general, and then a Crystal Palace game, which is probably the toughest game that they have. Whereas if I compare it to someone like Evan Nilsson, even though he's got the best chance of doubling, he has two tough fixtures here with Arsenal and Man City. And Man City would be one of the potential kind of blanking games. Where what I would say with, let's say, Leicester at home is maybe Evan Nilsson can be someone that I can move into for that final game week of the season. If the most and best game that, let's say, Evan Nilsson has is that one, then maybe I can just delay the transfer a little bit. Cunha is interesting, though, because he probably has a higher chance of doubling than Wood and actually has some really good fixtures, with the exception of Man City away. So the biggest question with someone like Cunha is, how are his minutes? Clearly, there was a point in the game and point in time within the season where he was amazing and consistently getting really, really good minutes. And I think under this manager, he's continued to get those good minutes. But with the recent suspension and all, coming back and playing 20 minutes, then actually playing 90 versus Man United, which is a huge positive. The biggest question, I think, with Cunha as a transfer is there some sort of element where, because Wolves are very safe now in their position in the league, they're continuing to win some games, do they not care about playing Cunha 89, 90 minutes a match to sort of maximize their chances of winning a game? I'm not sure whether that really matters. There's obviously the kind of hot head tax that Matheus Cunha has, very much like João Pedro, so we'll need to kind of monitor that situation. The last piece, of course, is, as I said, Wisa is probably the one that's the safest on all accounts, right? His minutes feel the safest. Evan Nilsson, I think, recently has also been playing 90 minutes compared to his average of 80 minutes earlier in the season. So those two players, I feel like, are the most nailed for minutes, whereas players like Chris Wood and even arguably Cunha, I guess, have slightly more susceptible minutes. Cunha more so for reasons off the field, and Chris Wood, I think, is just quite often utilized as an earlier substitute, which I think still has a bit of a net impact on someone like Wood, right? If there are other players who have, let's say, comparable or higher XG, slightly worse fixtures, but still play more minutes of football, at the end of the day, that's probably still more beneficial than what Chris Wood sometimes does in games, which is like a 75 to 85 minute substitute. So lots of forwards to pick between. I am right now quite inclined to actually just going for Cunha, just to kind of maximize on this Leicester at home game. Not caring so much about the Man City away game because honestly, it's not like Man City have looked that amazing on defense anyways. And otherwise, the Cunha matches are really, really good. So that's why I'm quite interested in going for Cunha. But as I said, Evan Nilsson's on the cards. And part of the reason why Evan Nilsson would still make a lot of sense is, once again, this aspect of the doubles that would help a lot with my own team structure. because I don't actually have triple City compared to the rest of the field that have 2 City. So because I've got 2 Bournemouth and 2 City, and then 1 hedge almost, which is Nico Williams, I don't think I'm in such a terrible position if, let's say, City weren't going to consolidate that double, and I still have Evan Nilsson with the singles that he has. So I don't think that'd be so much worse than, let's say, Cunha, for example, who might also just simply have no blanks whatsoever. But Cunha also has, as I said, a chance of a double, and that's what is quite enticing about going for him at this present moment in time. And with Wood, whilst he has really, really good fixtures, I just think he's got a lower chance of a double. And maybe it's wrong to sort of categorize Wood as such, but I just think that the minutes could be slightly worse as you have a bit more congestion for this Nottingham Forest schedule. And that's it, really. I still think that, unfortunately, they're just not building enough XG within games. When I look at that Tottenham match, yes, of course, they won 2-1, and it's a bit of game state because Tottenham spent a lot of the match chasing because Vicario, unfortunately, wasn't great with shot stopping this match. But you probably want to look at a team like Nottingham Forest and hope that they actually have slightly higher sort of average attacking team strength and are probably not relying on really heroic finishing this season from a lot of their players to produce those goals. So I kind of like Cunha on that basis because his XGI is actually quite strong and his minutes are quite strong as well. Whereas with Wood, XG is not too bad. XA is obviously not existent, but minutes are slightly precarious as well. So that's all I'll probably say within the strikers. And Sessegnon makes the most sense for me as a transfer because Saliba doesn't have a chance of doubling later on in the season. So selling someone like Saliba isn't going to hurt me so much. Whereas if I, let's say, kept Saliba as a player and actually went for my 11th player as maybe, let's say, a hit out for Eze, that hit out for Eze is probably going to have to be Semenyo because I'm bringing in someone, let's say, and I'd probably have to go Evan Nilsson just because of money reasons, right? So if I go for something like this is very, very tight in terms of my budget, but it could make sense in the sense that I'm fully backing, I suppose, a City and Bournemouth double in 36. I feel like this is a bit risky, though, obviously. I'm sure anyone watching this knows that that's the case, but the issue, I suppose, also is that I would have 3 Bournemouth players for that Arsenal match where hopefully, I suppose, they're rotating Gameweek 35, but I wouldn't feel so good about owning any sort of triple up attack versus Arsenal. Such a good defensive team, and I still think that it's unlikely that they'll rotate the center backs in between that PSG match. So that's what doesn't feel great. But then, of course, on the flip side, I could very much benefit a lot from the doubles. And Sessegnon's minutes, I think, are not guaranteed, right? You've got a lot of depth within this Fulham team, but we know that Marco Silva has constantly rotated those sort of left wing, right wing type positions over the entire season. We've seen Reece Nelson play, Willian play, we've seen Traore play at times, and Harry Wilson. So these are all the types of players that could play there, whereas right now it's Iwobi and Sessegnon. So it's tricky to say that Sessegnon makes a lot of sense as a bit more of a medium to long-term transfer. He certainly makes sense for a free hit, and I think everyone should consider him as long as he's fine and he's not actually injured. But the Semenyo transfer could actually be a little bit more robust from the point of view that the minutes are guaranteed for this hit-taking move, which is going to be for Semenyo. So lots of things to consider, but I think those are the kind of 2 viable paths that I could work with this week. In terms of how it actually would look like, I think the best thing to do would actually just be to shift on over towards the hub client. So we're here with the hub client, and we're actually looking at how these 2 transfer strategies would work out, right? So transfer strategy number 1 is this sort of Sessegnon move, and I'll probably sell Saliba. The reason why I'm selling Saliba over someone like Guardiola is simply because Guardiola has a chance of doubling. I don't really want to run the risk of losing that double, so that's why I'd rather sell Saliba at this point in time. And I think I still have a lot of nailed on players who should be playing most of the rest of the games of the season where I don't feel so bad about losing an Arsenal defender. Then I'd obviously probably sell Sarr, to be honest, just because I can afford it on this type of setup. So Mbumo comes in, and then João Pedro gets shifted off for someone like Cunha in this setup, and let's just optimize the team. So clearly this is going to be a hit, so it's not going to be a perfect team, but I think a game week rating of 92% is very, very strong regardless. Sessegnon probably underrated because the model hasn't probably adjusted to his kind of expected level of minutes right now, or maybe it's very precarious in the long term, but I think definitely very, very strong in the short term. So that's the kind of team setup. I think I'd be very, very happy with selecting this team even with the hit. On Game Week 35, the defense gets weakened a little bit because I do sell Saliba. However, you have to hope that with selling Saliba, the team probably benefits a little bit because maybe Arsenal still lose that clean sheet to a Bournemouth team that have been, for the most part, very good this season, at least on offense. And I would hope that a weakened Arsenal team probably means a weakened Game Week 35 for them. So On the flip side, I'll probably be, unfortunately, pitting Trippier versus Estupiñán together. There might be a chance where I just play Nico Williams over, I think, Estupiñán, because unfortunately, Brighton just look absolutely diabolical. So I think I might just choose to play Nico Williams in this situation. Regardless, though, I've kind of got one player against another in both circumstances, right? Let's say Eze versus a Nico Williams here, or Estupiñán versus Trippier, even though they're both defenders and clearly a 0-0 outcome could be nice, but I have Isak, right, leading the line. So that's kind of the situation that I think makes sense. I'd probably still play Cunha over Kluivert just because I respect the Arsenal defense a lot more. But I think this is a really strong team for Game Week 35, and clearly the AI agrees as such. And then in Game Week 36, we have the information from the FA Cups at this point in time anyways. I'd be rolling a free transfer. I can maximize whatever move that I want depending on whatever doubles we get. Another point to mention too, unfortunately, is of course, if we get doubles on 36, it means that we blank on 37. So there's really no need to plan transfers here at this point in time because we don't know what the doubles are. At the same time, I'll probably mention that if you already have too many doublers, by the time you reach Game Week 36, it might actually not make sense to actually be that invested or to over-invest in Game Week 36, because very much like 33 and 34, it's the inverse of each other, right? So on Game Week 37, you might have way too many blankers, and you need to consider that and kind of take a step back by looking at Game Week 37, looking at how many teams are going to play, how many doublers you're going to have in Game Week 36, and what that means for your team in Game Week 37. So that's the only kind of point of advice that I'd say now. It's not really relevant for this point of video, but I think that's kind of one of the set of transfers that makes a lot of sense for me. On the flip side, of course, as I said, the more I invest into doublers, like let's say maybe Evan Nilsson, Cunha, not Mbumo, but maybe Bournemouth players, for example, on the other variant, the worse it makes my team for Game Week 37. So that's a big consideration that I need to think about as well, where once again, it's the pros and cons of being able to field more doublers versus, conversely having more blankers as well on the week right after. So something to think about at this moment in time. I think it makes sense for me to go Evan Nilsson or Cunha. I think having one more doubler is totally fine. I'll be taking one prospective doubler out of my team anyways by going for Mbumo. And Sessegnon allows me to keep one of the doublers, potentially. But if I do make the second move, and if I kind of just reset into my option number 2 here, if I go for that sort of Semenyo path, I do kind of take away a lot of my Crystal Palace players. And that does enable me a little bit because, Semenyo is someone who works out really well when it comes to the double potential. But my team's going to be just inherently a lot worse if I go for Evan Nilsson, Semenyo in this situation, and suddenly there's no double, because I'd still kind of have to just take on that City away game in Game Week 37, and that probably makes my team significantly worse, which I don't really love. And then if I take out Sarr here for someone like Mbumo, one of the things that I don't love so much is, yes, of course, I'll have a pretty strong team, or if I take out Sarr here for Mbumo, yes, of course, I have a pretty strong team for, let's say, Game Week 34. I have a strong team for Game Week 35. Again, if I just optimize the team, and 36 looks amazing on paper, but then Game Week 37 could be very, very tough for me to manage as well with the kind of amount of blankers that I have. And of course, as I said, if we don't have a double in 36 and suddenly Bournemouth have this Man City away game, very hard to sort of get away with that one. I'll just have to play a lot of the Bournemouth players and just deal with that without having to use free transfers potentially. As I'll probably be trying to maximize on free transfers for Game Week 36. So that's kind of a big flip side to that strategy that I'm thinking about right now. I like a lot of the forwards, and I think there's merit to going all 4 forwards that I mentioned. Let me know what your thoughts are in terms of going for the forwards. I think Wisa might be the safest one, but at the same time, I do really want to kind of squeeze in as many doublers as possible. Maybe I just go Evan Nilsson, Mbumo, and Sessegnon as one of my free transfers. But also, once again, it's a bit precarious as I have to go for Sessegnon, and his minutes might not be 100% nailed for the rest of the season. And I do lose a very strong, sensible defender in Saliba as well in the process. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.